As a sequel, the TV series The Legend of Korra is inherently about carrying on the legacy of something that came before. The series is following up on Avatar the Last Airbender, and the obvious conclusion is that Korra is carrying on for the previous Avatar, Aang. She's the new Avatar, and for the people around her, it's easiest to compare her to the Avatar they grew up with. Hell, there's a giant statue of him towering over Republic City, a constant reminder of who came immediately before her. However, a closer reading of the show reveals it to not be that simple. She really isn't that much like Aang at all, and in particular, the series seems to want us to see her as following in the footsteps of Zuko, Prince of the Fire Nation and eventual Fire Lord. Of course, I don't mean that she was supposed to be the next Fire Lord, or that she's secretly his child, or anything like that. Rather, she's the one who behaves the most like he did, and several aspects of the show encourage us to draw that connection. The first similarity between the two is one of temperament. One of the first things we learn about Zuko in the first series is that he's constantly a boiling cauldron of rage. Iroh's efforts to console him or show him the value of a cooler head are mostly wasted. This primarily serves to contrast him with the calm, Buddhist-inspired Aang, but Zuko's anger is fundamentally different from that of the other characters as well. Katara and Sokka get mad all the time, but this mostly manifests as screaming or whatever, while Zuko is constantly smashing things and throwing fire around. Even Azula has more of a cold wickedness to her anger, at least until she totally loses her mind. Despite Zuko being one of the older members of the main cast, he consistently behaves the most like a child with his destructive tantrums. That is, until we meet Korra, and she behaves the same way. She is easily frustrated and takes it out on her environment. She's never more than one sour event from breaking things or hitting people. She destroyed an ancient airbender artifact, presumably because she's the first airbender to get mad enough at it to smash it. And notably, she did so entirely with fire. None of the friendly cast members in either show behave like these two do. This anger also connects them as related to their bending. Zuko spends most of his time in his series using his rage and aggression to fuel his bending and chase his goals. He only stops when his anger dies out and won't work as a source anymore, and then he has to find something more pure to replace it. This arc could be read a few different ways, but in essence, Zuko leaned on flawed emotions for a long time and couldn't truly master firebending until he let them go and found something new. Meanwhile, Korra is something of an odd avatar, because despite being born into the water tribe, she does comparatively little waterbending. The very first bending we see her do as a child is earth, and then fire, before finally showing water. Immediately after that, the exam we see her taking is a firebending one. Furthermore, when it comes to fighting with bending in the field, she doesn't lean on waterbending at all compared to fire or earth. Presumably this is how avatars are supposed to function, but the other ones we've seen didn't behave that way. Aside from fights meant to specifically illustrate Aang using all four elements, he tended to use airbending most of the time. The couple bits of Roku that we see in flashbacks have him mostly using fire, and the major event we see for Kyoshi is entirely done with earthbending. Korra seems to be the exception here. That same anger and stubbornness that leads to her to using more earth and fire than water is also what blocks her from initially learning airbending. Aang had his own issues, but nothing to the same extent. It took him one episode to get over his resistance to earthbending, while Korra's block took her basically an entire season to get past. Something about her temperament was fundamentally incompatible with what it means to be an airbender. It's also notable that her block doesn't seem to follow the normal conventions. For Aang, it's called out that avatars usually have issues with the element opposite their own, but hers isn't like that. Her opposing element in fire seems to come easily to her, while she struggles with the element of her predecessor. Zuko's element is easy, Aang's is hard. See what I'm getting at? In both Zuko and Korra, rage was a crutch that got them a certain distance in their bending, but ultimately was a barrier towards achieving their full potential. This bit is less important, but it also feels worth mentioning that Korra's only two love interests in the series, Mako and Asami, are both of Fire Nation descent. It could be a coincidence, but it could suggest some innate compatibility between Korra and the people of the Fire Nation. The next similarity is where the two get guidance from as they gradually figure out what to do with their lives. Zuko essentially has two states for this, when he's being taught by his uncle and when he has no one. Iroh's wisdom is one of the most iconic parts of Avatar the Last Airbender, even if Zuko isn't particularly receptive to it. I bring up Iroh because he's central to one of the ways the series most seems to go out of its way to compare Zuko and Korra. Korra, like Aang and all the other avatars, has access to all of her past selves for wisdom and advice. In general, this would point to her resembling Aang, since he asks for advice from Avatar Roku all the time, but unlike Aang, Korra almost never takes advantage of this resource. At first, she can't, struggling to access the spiritual parts of being the Avatar at all. She reconnects to Aang and learns energy bending from him, but afterwards kind of goes back to how things were before. She technically could ask the Avatars for help at any time, but basically never chooses to do so. This separates her from Aang, both in where she gets wisdom from, but also her rejection of those spiritual powers, something Aang was extremely in tune with. It gets even more explicit in Season 2, when she actually meets Iroh himself. He helps her in her time of need, offering wisdom and teaching her the value of kindness and generosity, exactly how he taught Zuko nearly 100 years ago. If any character should be long gone by the events of The Legend of Korra, it should be Iroh, who was old even in the original series. Instead, the show bends over backwards looking for a reason to have Korra meet and learn from Iroh. Later on in the same season, Korra's past lives are obliterated by Vaatu, taking away her ability to converse with Aang and the others. This would leave her alone, except we again talk to Iroh, who points her towards Zuko for advice. Not only does this explicitly set Zuko up as a replacement for Aang, it would also seem to be saying that her bond to Zuko and Iroh is even stronger and more resilient than her connection to her past lives. Even so, their conversation is brief and in the end boils down to, you need to figure out what's important for yourself. Which brings me back to the comparison with Zuko. As I said earlier, Zuko chooses to leave Iroh and adventure on his own for a large portion of the series. It is during this time alone that Zuko learns to cast off his childish ways and grow as a person. Even though he had a fantastic role model in Iroh, just like Korra, he had to get away from that role model in order to figure out who he wanted to be. Both of them grew their character by looking inward, rather than by receiving help. Related to this point, Korra and Zuko are the only characters across all 116 episodes that have one titled X Character Alone. In both of these episodes, we follow the named character without seeing a single other major character discounting flashbacks. If more people got episodes like this, it could just be called a sub-theme or whatever, but when it's just for those two, it feels like a pretty purposeful comparison. Which brings me to the last point. The place the show most wants us to compare Zuko and Korra is in the arcs of their heroes' journeys. These are both pretty long shows with a million story beats, so I'll try to distill it down to what I think are the most important points. First, they both start their adventure without knowing what their end goal is going to be. Aang knew that his goal was to defeat the Fire Lord and restore balance to the world, and that never really changed. Zuko, though, thought his purpose was to capture the Avatar and ended up doing something completely different. Probably don't need to explain that one more deeply. Korra's journey is a little more nuanced, mostly because she didn't really know what she was supposed to do with her life. She seems to have had some vague notion of just being the Avatar, but without any idea what that actually meant. She does do some political peacekeeping, like Aang, but her more impactful role was opening the gates to the spirit world and restoring airbending to the world. If you had asked her in Season 1, Episode 1 what her defining accomplishments would be, she wouldn't have been able to guess it in a million years. Both Zuko and Korra found themselves in radically different positions than they could have predicted. This is also a good time to mention a key difference between Aang's quest and Korra's. Aang's story was always about bringing balance to the world, while Korra's is consistently couched as a conflict between light and darkness. As Aang had to learn when he started learning firebending, fire is the element of light and life. Just one more way her purpose seems closer to Zuko's than to Aang's. Related to their journeys is the fact that both Korra and Zuko had to struggle against outside expectations that were placed on them. Zuko's key moment of character growth comes when he gets everything he thought he wanted and is sickened to find that it doesn't matter to him anymore. He spent his entire life being told that the ultimate goal was to be a loyal son and a good soldier. Everyone around him, except Iroh of course, laid out exactly what he was supposed to do and who he was supposed to be. Capture the Avatar, win back your honor, make your dad and sister proud. Do so by being ruthless and cruel and aggressive. It took him a long time to work past these bad lessons, but doing so led him to proper self-actualization. Similarly, much of Korra's story is people telling her who and what she's supposed to be. Everyone except Katara wants her to wait patiently for Tenzin to come back to the South Pole to teach her airbending, even though she needs to learn it as soon as possible to fulfill her destiny. Tenzin doesn't want her to be a pro-bender, thinking it isn't dignified, even though that's what she wants to do. A fair number of people seem to think that the Avatar doesn't have a place in the modern world, with the chief of police wanting to kick Korra out of town right from the beginning. Even after she becomes a properly realized Avatar, most political figures want nothing to do with her, and constantly tell her things along the lines of, know your place. Every time people put these limits on her, she casts them off and grows from it. Much like Zuko, her potential lies in escaping the limits and expectations people try to place on her. Aang occasionally struggled under the weight of the world's expectations, but he solved the problem by rising to their challenge, rather than rejecting them and doing something different. Again, Korra is much closer to Zuko than to Aang. The most important and explicit similarity stems from the above, and that is that both Korra and Zuko abdicate their titles to continue their personal growth, only to take them back up again when they're ready. For Zuko, this actually happens multiple times, both when he was a wanted fugitive and again when he left voluntarily to join the Avatar. Both times, he gave up the luxury and privilege associated with being a Fire Nation prince to continue adventuring on his own. Even when he was initially exiled, Zuko was given a ship and a crew, far more than he would be left with later. Similarly, Korra could have continued the rest of her life in gentle rehabilitation with plenty of people to love and take care of her, but she chose to throw that all away in favor of trying to get herself better on the open road. Both of them would eventually return to their positions, but both of them needed time away in order to be truly worthy of those titles. This commonality to both of their stories is actually what made me think of this comparison in the first place, because of a scene that is so similar it feels like it must be intentional. Both Zuko and Korra have well-defined hairstyles that are key, distinctive parts of their appearance, and both of them cut off their ponytails when they run away. For both of them, it's a heavy symbolic moment in addition to a practical one. They're cutting away that part of their identity while hoping to go unrecognized. It's hard to believe that the creators of these series didn't want us to view these moments and the characters involved in the same light. Korra being Zuko's spiritual successor is one of those literature things that occurred as a small idea and seemed to grow stronger and more plausible the more I tugged at it. Hopefully I've convinced you all as well. Did I miss any other similarities? Let me know in the comments below. Enjoy this long-form analysis content? Please subscribe to my channel so you can see the rest of my stuff as it comes out. That's all for today. Thanks for watching.